The sand fused into glass before anyone even saw what caused it. Picture this, a heat signature above the dunes of Eridu. Something hovering where absolutely nothing should hover, pressing the air down until just taking a breath became a conscious effort. The creators had crossed the void, flesh and purpose wrapped in metal, descending onto a world they fully intended to reshape from its bones. Listen closely. What you are about to hear doesn't come from a fantasy book. It comes straight from Sumerian tablets, Akkadian texts and researchers who spent their entire lives decoding them. These are theories, yes, but the evidence is screaming. The final verdict? That belongs to you. This story traces one single thread, from a dying star to wet clay, from the very first breath of a species that shouldn't even exist, to the flood that nearly wiped it out. But here is the catch. Something in the final chapter changes the meaning of everything you just heard. If you want to see what 6,000 years of dead silence have been hiding, stay until the end. And if you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, perhaps tonight you were meant to. The crops turned black in the fields of Nibiru's eastern continent. 3 harvests in a row, dead before the grain could form. The soil cracked open in patterns that looked like veins on an old man's hand. Rivers that had fed civilizations for millennia shrank to brown threads you could step across without wetting your knees. And the sky was wrong. Thinner, paler, like looking at the world through a cloth that keeps losing threads. People in the outer provinces started wearing breathing filters, first by choice, then because their lungs burned without them. Anu called the council on the 9th day of the atmospheric failure. 11 commanders seated in a crescent of volcanic glass, deep underground where temperature could still be controlled. He stood at the center. No notes, no projection screens, just his voice, stripped down to bare fact. The shield has 40 cycles, maybe less. After that, the radiation reaches ground level and everything on the surface dies. He let the silence do the work. 11 faces processing extinction. Enlil broke first. Options. Anu shook his head. One option, gold, suspended in the upper atmosphere as a particle barrier. We need more than this planet has left to give. Enki had been running numbers for 6 months before the council session. Scans of the inner solar system. Mineral signatures bouncing back from a small blue planet, third from its star. Massive gold deposits buried under continental rock in the southern hemisphere. Fresh water, breathable atmosphere, a magnetosphere still functioning. He spread the data across the council table without asking permission. Here, everything we need is here. Enlil looked at the readings like someone had spilled something on his floor. You want to send our people across the void to dig dirt on a planet we have never touched. Enki held his stare. I want our people to be alive in 50 cycles. Do you? The ships were cargo vessels, built for hauling mineral loads between orbital stations. Bulky, slow, armored against debris, but designed for short runs. Engineering crews spent 20 rotations reinforcing hulls, installing long-range navigation, stripping out anything unnecessary to make room for extraction equipment. 50 ships, 400 crew, volunteers on paper. In reality, people who understood that staying on Nibiru was a slower way to die. Launch happened from the dark side. No ceremony. No broadcast to the population. Anu made that decision personally. Panic would cost more lives than silence. The fleet broke atmosphere in sequence, engines burning blue against a sky that had already started to yellow. Inside the flagship, Enlil reviewed crew manifests and supply ratios. Enki sat in the lower deck with a viewport the size of his hand, watching Nibiru shrink, red-brown, scarred. The planet that made them looked tired from this distance, like something ready to stop trying. The crossing killed 7 ships. The asteroid belt moved faster than their sensors could map. Fragments of rock the size of buildings tumbling through corridors, the navigation charts marked as clear. Each loss registered on Enlil's console as a blip, a number reducing. He adjusted supply calculations in real time, redistributing rations across 43 remaining vessels without pausing the briefing he was conducting. Enki felt each one. He pulled the crew rosters of the lost ships and read every name. It took him 4 hours. He did not sleep after. Then, through the forward viewport of the flagship, blue. A sphere of water and cloud hanging in empty space. No one on board had ever seen a living ocean. No one had breathed air that was not manufactured, filtered, recycled through machines. The ship banked toward the southern hemisphere. Heat signatures between 2 rivers. Flat terrain. Landmass stable enough for structures. Enlil stood from his command chair and opened the fleet channel. All vessels are just heading. Descent formation. We land between the rivers. The hull plates heated red as atmosphere grabbed the ship and pulled it down. Below, a world with no name waited in the dark. It had no idea what was falling toward it. Heat hit them before anything else. The hatch cracked open and the air came in like a wall. Wet, heavy, thick enough to chew. The celestial ones who stepped onto the mud between the Tigris and the Euphrates were not conquerors planting flags. They were survivors climbing out of a metal box after months in the void. Dust stuck to their boots. Insects rose from the marsh in clouds. Humidity wrapped around their bodies and stayed there like a second skin. Enlil stood at the base of the ramp, scanning the flat brown nothing that stretched in every direction. His face said everything his mouth did not. A senior officer kicked the ground. His foot sank to the ankle. This is what we crossed for. Behind him, cargo containers were already tilting into soft soil, leaning sideways like drunk monuments. Equipment designed for rock extraction sat useless on a surface that behaved like wet bread. 3 ships back, Enki was knee-deep in river water, filling sample containers. He tasted it. Salt, sediment, but underneath, fresh, workable. He sealed the vial and kept moving downstream, cataloging everything his eyes touched. Plants with white sap, fish with 4 gill chambers, soil that changed color every 30 meters. This planet was messy, raw, unfinished. He liked it. The first structure took 40 rotations. The ground fought every foundation they poured. Walls cracked as clay dried under a sun that felt closer here than Nibiru's fading light. Heavier, more aggressive. They learned to mix mud with reed fiber for stability. Learned which riverbank held firm after rain, and which would swallow a building overnight. Eridu rose ugly and functional, straight lines pressed into a landscape that only knew curves. It looked like exactly what it was. A base camp built by people who did not plan to stay, but had nowhere else to go. Enlil set up the command perimeter on high ground north of the river fork. Guard towers. Communication arrays aimed at the home world. Supply rationing calculated to the last unit. He ran the settlement the way he ran everything. Tight, measured, with zero tolerance for waste or complaint. Shifts operated by star positions. Rest was assigned, not requested. When a technician collapsed from heat on the 26th rotation, Enlil had the body carried inside and ordered the remaining crew to finish the shift. The mission had a schedule. The schedule did not accommodate weakness. Enki built south. Near the marshlands where the river slowed into shallow pools, he constructed what later records would call the Abzu, half submerged in groundwater, cool when everything else burned. He worked alone most nights, dissecting animals that came to drink at dusk, studying root systems that pulled water from soil that looked completely dry, cataloguing bacteria in mud samples that glowed faint green under certain light conditions. He filled tablets with questions, not reports. What has this planet already tried to build? How far did it get before we arrived? The two brothers never shared a meal. Their camps faced opposite directions. Enlil's pointed at the sky, Enki's aimed at the ground. The crews felt the split before anyone named it. Two visions of the same mission. One saw a mining operation with a departure date. The other saw something he was still figuring out how to describe. Between them, Eridu grew. Crude structures multiplied along the riverbank. Storage units, processing stations. A landing pad flattened by dragging equipment across wet clay until the surface hardened. At night, the generators hummed low, and the Mesopotamian sky opened above, so dense with stars it looked solid, like a ceiling close enough to touch. The first transmission from Nibiru came on rotation 53. Encrypted, short, 3 words after decoding: send the gold. Atmospheric decay had accelerated beyond projections. The shield was failing faster than anyone had modeled. Suddenly, Eridu was not a settlement. It was a mine entrance with living quarters attached. Enlil turned south, toward mountains past the horizon. Somewhere under that rock, the gold sat in veins of quartz and basalt, waiting for someone to cut it out. He opened the crew channel. I need 300 bodies in the southern sector. Full extraction protocol. We start digging in 10 rotations. The Igigi, young, strong, built for labor, heard the order in their quarters. They did not know it yet, but that transmission had just decided the shape of their lives for the next several thousand years. Shaft 1 opened on a Tuesday by Earth's count, though no one was counting yet. The Igigi descended in crews of 20, carrying picks built for asteroid mining that shattered against the first layer of basalt. The rock here was different. Dense, stubborn. It absorbed impact instead of cracking, and the vibration ran back up the handle into wrists and elbows and shoulders until the joints swelled and the fingers stopped closing properly. By the end of the first rotation, 4 picks had broken. By the 10th, they stopped counting broken tools and started counting broken hands. Dig faster. That was the message from Eridu. 2 words on a transmission tablet, stamped with Enlil's seal. The Igigi crew chief read it out loud to his team at the bottom of Shaft 3. Nobody laughed. Nobody reacted at all. Reactions require energy, and energy was something the mines ate faster than food could replace. The tunnels went deeper every week, 200 meters, 300, pushing toward veins of gold that the surface scans promised were thick and pure. The scans were right. The gold was there. But getting to it meant crawling through corridors too low to stand in, breathing air that tasted like hot iron, working in heat that came up from the planet's core and pressed against skin like a fever that belonged to the Earth itself. Gold went north, sealed in containers, launched toward orbital relays that bounced each payload across the void to Nibiru. Every shipment brought the homeworld a few more months of atmosphere. Anu sent confirmations. Short, cold, formatted identically every time. Tonnage received. Next quota attached. The Igigi never appeared in those messages. Their names occupied no database on the homeworld. They existed only in the space between the pick and the rock, and when that space closed, when a tunnel collapsed or a body gave out, The space simply reassigned itself to the next pair of hands. Months stopped making sense underground. Some Igigi lost track of how long they had been below. Sleep happened in shifts on rock floors, still warm from the crew before. Food arrived in sealed packs that tasted the same, regardless of what the label said. One worker started scratching lines into his tunnel wall, 1 mark per shift. He stopped at 412. After that, the wall ran out of space, and he ran out of reasons to keep counting. Enki came down once. He walked the primary shaft without speaking, watching crews work a gold seam, with movements that had crossed beyond exhaustion into something mechanical. Arms swinging because arms swing. Lungs pulling air because lungs pull air. He stayed 11 minutes, climbed out before sunset, sat in the abzu with his feet in the water, and drew shapes in the wet clay with his finger. Outlines that looked, if you stood at the right angle, like hands. The break started with one body refusing to stand. Shaft 7, deep section. An Igigi put his pick down, sat on the rubble, and stayed there. His crew stopped around him, confused because the concept of stopping did not exist in their operational framework. A supervisor crossed the tunnel, gave the order. The Igigi looked up with eyes that had forgotten the color of sky. "Come down here yourself." 4 words, unrecorded on any tablet. But they moved through the shafts faster than sound, carried from crew to crew like a match touched to a fuse line that had been soaking in oil for years. Within 3 rotations, the mines were silent. Picks thrown to the surface. Carts overturned. 300 Igigi stood above ground, blinking at a sun they barely recognized. And at the mouth of the primary shaft, a fire burned tool handles into black smoke that rose straight up like a signal to anyone watching from orbit. The gold stopped flowing. Nibiru's countdown resumed. And somewhere between the two, between a dying planet and a burning pit, the next chapter of this story was already taking shape in the mind of one god who had spent 11 minutes watching suffering and understood exactly what it meant. Enlil saw the smoke before he received the transmission. A black column rising from the southern horizon, straight as a pillar, visible from the Eridu compound at dawn. He knew what it meant before the words came through the channel. "The Igigi have stopped. All 300. The shafts are empty." He dressed, armed his escort. 40 guards in full equipment loaded onto 3 transport vessels heading south at maximum speed. He did not brief his staff. He did not consult Anu. Enlil was not a god who asked for permission to solve problems he considered beneath the dignity of asking. 300 Igigi stood in loose clusters across the plateau above the mines. Barefoot, dust in every crease of their skin. Some sat on the ground with their backs to each other, too exhausted to care about formation or solidarity, or whatever this was supposed to look like from above. The fire at the shaft entrance had burned down to a circle of black soot and twisted metal. Pick handles, cart axles, everything that connected their hands to the gold. Gone. Enlil's transports landed 200 meters east. The guards formed a line. He walked through them and stopped 3 meters from the nearest Igigi. "Who speaks for this?" Wind. Silence. A voice from somewhere in the middle. Rough and anonymous. "The mines speak. Go down and listen." Enlil opened the emergency channel to Nibiru before his boots were clean. "Insubordination, full scale. I am requesting authorization for elimination and replacement crew from home." Anu's response took 11 hours. It said what Enlil already knew, but refused to accept. Nibiru could not send replacements. The population was shrinking. Agricultural sectors were collapsing. 300 workers pulled from the homeworld would accelerate the atmospheric deadline, by decades. The Igigi were the only labor force that existed, and they were sitting in the dirt, refusing to stand. The standoff held for 4 days. Enlil kept his guards in position. The Igigi kept sitting. Nobody ate much. The supply drops from Eridu came every 12 hours. Ration packs tossed from low-flying transports that did not land. On the 3rd night, a fight broke out between 2 Igigi over a water container. It lasted 9 seconds. Both were too weak to throw a second punch. Enlil watched from his command tent through a surveillance feed and saw what he refused to name. These were not rebels. These were bodies that had reached a limit he did not believe existed. Enki arrived on day 4 without guards, without announcement. He walked past the perimeter, past the armed line, past Enlil's tent, sat down on the scorched ground where the fire had been, facing the Igigi, close enough to smell the mine dust baked into their skin. He stayed 2 hours, watching the way he watched everything: insects, fish, root systems, anything that survived conditions designed to kill it. When he stood up, his knees were black with soot, and his mind was already somewhere else, somewhere underground, in the Abzu, where the clay samples waited. The council session crackled across encrypted channels. Eridu, the southern camp, Nibiru's orbital relay. Enlil spoke first. Punish them, make examples, discipline holds, or everything falls. Enki waited until the channel went quiet. They're dying, brother. When the last one drops, you will hold the pick yourself, unless... A pause that stretched long enough for the relay to send a connection check. We make something else to hold it. Enlil stared at his console. Make what? Enki reached into his satchel and pulled out a sealed container of river clay, still damp, still carrying the smell of the marshlands. He pressed his thumb into the surface. 5 ridges, a perfect print. Something this planet already knows how to build. I just need to finish the job. Outside the tent, the Igigi slept on bare ground, under a sky full of stars they had no names for. They did not know what had been proposed. They did not know that their suffering had just opened a door that could never be closed again. A door between gods and clay, between creators and something that did not yet exist, but would, within a few rotations, open its eyes and breathe. Ninhursag crossed the marshlands by reed boat on a night with no moon. She carried her instruments wrapped in oiled cloth. Blades, extraction tubes, compression vessels, things that had no names in any language spoken above ground. Enki was waiting at the entrance of the Abzu with wet hands and a look she had seen only once before, decades ago, when he had dismantled a failing atmospheric processor on Nibiru and rebuilt it from memory in 11 hours. The look of someone who has already solved the problem in his head and needs his hands to catch up. "Show me," she said. He led her down. The chamber sat below the waterline. No windows, no ventilation beyond a single shaft that pulled air from the marsh surface. Stone walls, sweating condensation. A long table carved from river rock held 47 clay samples, arranged by mineral density, each one tagged with soil origin and calcium content. Beside them, sealed containers of organic compound. Tissue cultures harvested from animals, plant extracts, bacterial colonies Enki had been growing in water tanks for months. Ninhursag touched the clay, pressed it between her fingers, smelled it. This is close, but clay does not breathe. You know that. He knew. Clay holds shape. Clay accepts pressure. But it does not carry life code. For that, you need something already alive. Something with genetic architecture complex enough to bridge the gap between mineral and organism. Enki opened a sealed compartment in the chamber's north wall. Inside, a single vessel of polished stone, cold, heavy, containing blood drawn from a god named Wee Isla, minor rank, low in the council hierarchy, chosen for reasons the records do not fully explain. Some accounts say he was connected to the Igigi rebellion. Others say he volunteered. What every account agrees on is that Wee Ila entered this chamber and did not leave it. His blood, his flesh, his Timu. The word sits somewhere between consciousness and genetic blueprint, extracted and prepared for mixing. Ninhursag combined the compounds herself. Divine blood into river clay, organic tissue into mineral paste. She worked with her hands directly in the material. No tools, fingers shaping the mixture at a molecular level through techniques Enki could calculate but could not replicate. The first attempt collapsed in 9 minutes, a shape that twitched once and liquefied. The second held longer, bipedal, symmetric. Something that looked like eyelids forming on a face that melted before they could open. 6 more failures, beings that stood but could not process oxygen. Chest cavities that opened and closed, mimicking breath without achieving it. Each one documented on a tablet Enki pressed into wet clay, with handwriting that got worse every entry. The 14th night, Ninhursag changed the ratios. Less blood, merite mineral. She added her own saliva to the surface layer. Nikite, sealing compound over living tissue, the way a membrane seals a cell. Enki watched without speaking. Her hands moved inside the clay, like they were listening to it, following instructions that came from somewhere below language. Below thought. She finished and stepped back. Both of them stared at the form on the table. It did not move. For a long time it did not move. Then, warmth rising from the clay surface. Enki touched it. A pulse, faint, irregular, something learning to beat for the first time. The shape expanded along the chest. Clay cracked at the sternum, and underneath, pink tissue caught the lamplight. Fingers separated from a fused mass, curling slow, testing air. Ninhursag's hands were suspended above the form, trembling. She did not touch it. She did not dare. Sound. A mouth opened, dark oval in a face still half covered in drying clay. And air rushed into lungs that had existed for less than a minute. The exhale came out raw, broken, loud in that sealed chamber. Eyes opened, unfocused, wet, staring at the low stone ceiling without understanding what a ceiling was. The first human breath bounced off the walls of the Abzu, and neither god in that room moved, neither spoke. The thing between them on the table was alive. It was breathing, and it was looking at them with an expression that had no precedent in the history of any world. The face of something that exists and does not yet know why. It is breathing. Ninhursag's voice came through the channel, flat and factual. Enlil received the transmission in Eridu, standing over mining coordinates he would never use the same way again. He replayed the message twice, walked out of the command tent into the heat, and stood there staring south toward the marshlands, trying to calculate the weight of what his brother had just done. 14 more were produced in the following rotations. 7 males, 7 females. Enki insisted on the split over Ninhursag's objection that reproductive capability would make population uncontrollable. Uncontrollable is a problem for later. Right now, I need them surviving past 48 hours without organ failure. 3 did not make it through the first night. Lungs that forgot to keep working once consciousness withdrew. 11 remained, breathing, feeding when food was placed in their mouths, standing when pulled upright, alive the way fire is alive, present, reactive, incapable of explaining itself. Enlil flew south on the 9th day. walked into the Abzu holding area, where 11 beings sat on reed mats under low light, skin still carrying the grey tone of river clay that no washing could remove. He studied them the way he studied equipment. Can they hold a pick? Enki nodded. Can they follow commands? Enki spoke a single word in the Igigi work dialect, Di-ig, and the nearest Adamu turned its head toward the sound. Enlil crouched in front of it, looked into its face. The Adamu looked back. Something passed between them that Enlil would never acknowledge. He stood. Send 6 to the southern shafts. The first Adamu entered the mines carrying tools built for hands twice their size. Shaft 4. Reopened, reinforced, still smelling of the rebellion's fire. They hit rock, clumsy, slow, breaking handles, missing the gold seam by margins that made the supervising Igigi wince. But they kept going, hour after hour. No complaint, no fatigue signals that matched anything in the Igigi behavioral range. They simply did not stop. Their bodies broke differently. Skin tore, bones cracked, blood ran down the tool handles into the dust. But the threshold that had shattered 300 gods did not seem to exist inside these things. They had no concept of refusal. The word had not been poured into them, output improved by the 3rd rotation. Enki modified the next batch, denser bone structure, broader grip span, lung capacity increased by a factor the tablet's recorders twice the breadth of the first. Ninhursag refined the neural compound to allow basic pattern recognition. The new Adamu could identify a gold vein by color and texture without being shown every time. They learned routes through the tunnel system. They responded to 6 vocal commands. And they multiplied, because Enki had built that function in, and it worked faster than either creator had projected. Within 30 rotations, the mines were producing at full capacity. Gold flowed north in quantities that exceeded anything the Igigi had managed in years of labor. Anu's transmissions from Nibiru changed tone. Still formal, still short, but carrying a frequency of communication that suggested something close to relief. The atmospheric shield program was back on schedule. The Igigi were reassigned to supervisory roles, surface operations, transport logistics. They walked above ground now, slept in structures with ventilation, ate food that had flavor. Below them, in the shafts they had abandoned, the Adamu worked in darkness without asking why. Enki visited the mines every 7th rotation. He told himself it was quality control, monitoring physical degradation rates, adjusting the compound for the next production cycle. But he lingered longer than data collection required. He watched them, the way they moved in groups without being instructed to, the way one would pause when another fell and stand near the body until it rose again. Behaviors he had not programmed. Patterns emerging from somewhere inside the clay that had nothing to do with divine blood or mineral compound. On his 9th visit, an Adamu in shaft 12 looked directly at him, held eye contact for 4 full seconds, and Enki felt something shift in his chest that he had no word for. He left the mine and did not write a report that night. The first birth happened in a reed enclosure near the Abzu, unattended. No god was present, no ceremony. An Adamu female lay on dried grass and produced a smaller version of herself in the dark, guided by instructions written somewhere inside her body that Enki had not put there. The infant screamed, a sound completely unlike the controlled vocalizations the adults used in the mines. Raw, unfiltered. It carried across the marsh and reached the compound when Ninhursag was cataloging bone density data. She stopped writing, walked to the enclosure, found the female holding the infant against her chest with both arms, rocking it in a motion that existed in no behavioral template. No one had taught her that. Her body knew. Enki received the report with silence. He sat with the data for 3 days, running projections on reproduction rates, gestation periods, generational output. The numbers climbed fast. Too fast. What had taken him a Ninhursag 14 failed attempts and a dead god's blood to produce once. The Earth was now doing on its own, over and over, without the chamber, without the compound, without permission. He filed the projections in the sealed alcove behind his workspace and showed them to no one. Within 60 rotations, the Adamu population had tripled. They spilled beyond the mining perimeter into the flat plains between the rivers, forming clusters that looked, from the aerial surveys Enlil ran every 10 rotations, disturbingly like settlements. Small groups around water sources, shared food stores, division of tasks that nobody had assigned. Some gathered reeds and built shelters that mimicked in crude proportion the structures of Eridu. Others dug irrigation channels from the river to patches of wild grain, redirecting water with a sophistication that required planning. Planning required thought. Thought had not been part of the original design. Enlil called Enki to Eridu on rotation 200. The meeting was not a request. They are building. Enki said nothing. They are building, brother. Structures, water systems. I watched a group of them redirect a tributary using a dam made of packed mud and timber. That is engineering. Enki looked at the aerial images spread across the table. It is problem solving. The river flooded their food supply. They adapted. Enlil slammed his hand flat on the table. They were built to dig. Adaptation was not in the specification. Cities. The word did not apply yet, but something was forming that would eventually require it. UR rose along the western bank, where the river curved wide and the soil held firm year-round. Nippur grew around a natural elevation that flooded last during the wet season. Lagash spread across a delta where 3 water channels met. Each settlement organized itself differently. Different layouts, different hierarchies, different solutions to the same problems of food, shelter, water. The Adamu were not copying their creators. They were improvising. And at the center of each settlement, without exception, they built something vertical. A mound, a platform, a raised structure of packed earth and brick that pointed upward, toward the sky, toward something they could not name, but oriented themselves around the way plants orient toward light. Ninhursag watched the development from the Absu with an expression Enki could not read. They are worshipping, she said one evening, reviewing footage of an Adamu group placing food offerings at the base of a mud platform in Nippur. They do not know what we are, but they know something is above them, and they are trying to reach it. Enki took the footage and stored it without comment. He had started sleeping less. The questions on his tablets had changed, no longer about soil compounds and tissue density. Now they asked things like, at what point does a tool become a being? At what point does a being become a problem? The answer was already forming. Across encrypted channels, in transmissions between Eridu and Nibiru, in private conversations between commanders who had started using a word that made Enki's stomach tighten every time he intercepted it. Containment. The created ones were spreading, thinking, building. And the gods who had made them from mud and blood were beginning to split into 2 camps. Those who saw children, and those who saw a threat multiplying out of control across a planet that was never supposed to belong to them. The first symbol was drawn in wet sand near the river at UR. A vertical line crossed by 2 diagonals, meaningless to anyone watching from the orbital relay. But Enki recognized it. He had used that symbol in his own notation system for cataloging mineral compounds. An Adamu had seen it on a tablet left unattended outside the Abzu and reproduced it from memory. Imperfect, slightly off angle, but recognizable. Enki erased it with his foot before anyone else could see. That night, he sat alone in the underground chamber, staring at the wall, knowing he was about to do something that would put him on the opposite side of his brother permanently. He started with agriculture. Small interventions disguised as environmental shifts. Seed varieties placed near Adamu settlements where they would be found and planted. Irrigation patterns scratched into clay tablets left at the edge of cultivated fields, positioned to look like natural erosion marks. The Adamu did not question where the knowledge came from. They absorbed it the way dry soil absorbs rain, completely, immediately, already reaching for more. Within 20 rotations, the settlements along the Euphrates had organized planting cycles that matched seasonal flood patterns with an accuracy that required astronomical observation. They were watching the stars, tracking the moon, marking time. Writing came next. Enki built a system of wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay, simple enough for the Adamu to reproduce with a reed stylus, complex enough to carry meaning beyond a single generation. He introduced it through intermediaries. Adamu who had shown pattern recognition above the baseline, individuals who lingered near the Abzu and seemed to understand that the structure in the marsh was different from everything else in their world. He taught them at night, one at a time, each session erasing the previous tablet and starting fresh so that no physical evidence accumulated in one place. Enlil found out through the grain. UR's agricultural output quadrupled in a single season, an impossibility without external input. He pulled the harvest data, cross-referenced it with planting patterns, and traced the irrigation design back to a geometric logic that no Adamu should have been capable of producing. The math was Anunnaki. He flew to the Abzu unannounced, found Enki in the lower chamber with 3 Adamu seated on the floor, each holding a reed stylus, each pressing symbols into clay with steady hands. Enki looked up. He did not try to hide it. There was nothing left to hide. You are arming them. Enlil's voice was quiet, which was worse than shouting. Enki stood. I am teaching them. Teaching them what? To read? To calculate? To track the movements of stars they have no business understanding? Enki held his ground. To survive without us, because we will not be here forever, and when we leave, they need to be able to... Enlil cut him. They were not built to survive without us. They were built to serve us. Every symbol you press into their heads is a weapon pointed at this operation. He turned and walked out. The 3 Adamu on the floor watched him leave, their styluses frozen mid-stroke, understanding nothing of the words but reading the violence in the air, the way animals read a coming storm. The knowledge spread anyway. Writing moved from UR to Nippur to Lagash, through trade routes the Adamu had built without anyone authorizing them. Agricultural techniques passed between settlements carried by travelers who walked days along the riverbank to exchange information. Clay tablets wrapped in wet cloth to keep them readable. Astronomical charts appeared on the walls of the mud platforms that sat at the center of each city, tracking lunar cycles and stellar positions with growing precision. The Adamu were building a civilization, brick by brick, symbol by symbol, and every piece of it carried Enki's fingerprints. Enlil filed his report to Anu on an encrypted channel reserved for existential threats. The language was measured, but the meaning was clear. The created ones had exceeded design parameters. They possessed knowledge that made them capable of independent operation. And the source of that knowledge was sitting in a chamber beneath the marshlands, teaching mud creatures to read the sky. Anu's response arrived in 4 words that carried the weight of a verdict. The serpent will answer. Enki, the wise one, Lord of Earth, the god who loved his creation enough to give it the one thing that would guarantee its survival and ensure his own punishment. He received the summons at dawn, read it once, placed it face down on his work table, and went back to teaching. The readings came from the orbital station first. A gravitational anomaly pulling at the southern ice mass. Slow, constant, building in pressure over decades the way a fist tightens before it strikes. The data sat in Enlil's console for 6 rotations before he opened it. When he did, he ran the calculations 3 times. Each time, the result was the same. The southern ice shelf was destabilizing. A planetary-scale displacement event was building. Water volume sufficient to cover every landmass between the mountain ranges. Not a flood, an erasure. He closed the file, locked it under his personal encryption, and told no one. The second reading came from Nibiru's long-range observation array. The homeworld's orbital path was bringing it close enough to the inner solar system to exert tidal force on the 3rd planet. A gravitational pull that would accelerate the ice displacement by a factor the models could not contain within survivable parameters. Enlil requested a private channel with Anu. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. No record of it exists on any tablet. What followed was an assembly order. Every senior Anunnaki summoned to Eridu for a council session classified at the highest level. The Igigi were excluded. The Adamu were not mentioned. The agenda carried a single word: protocol. The council chamber in Eridu had not held a full assembly since the early rotations. Dust covered the secondary seats. The ventilation system struggled with the body heat of 19 commanders packed into a space designed for 12. Enlil stood at the center and presented the data without commentary. Ice mass calculations, displacement projections, tidal acceleration curves, timeline. He let the numbers do the work. When the last projection faded from the display, the room was silent. Ninhursag spoke first. How long? Enlil folded his arms. 12 cycles, maybe 14. The southern shelf goes first. After that, the wave propagation covers everything below 3,000 meters of elevation in approximately 7 days. Evacuate them. Enki said it before the formal discussion opened. Every head turned. Enlil stared at him with an expression that had been building for years, decades, since the first Adamu drew a symbol in the sand. Evacuate what? There are tens of thousands of them now, spread across every river valley on this continent. You want to move them to high ground? Build vessels? Save the creatures that were designed to carry picks and sortor? Enki held his gaze. I want to save what we made. Enlil leaned forward. What you made, without authorization, beyond specification, against direct orders. And now you want me to clean up the consequences. The vote was not close, 15-4. The Adamu would not be warned. The flood would come and the created ones would face it with no knowledge, no preparation, no chance. The gods would retreat to orbital stations and high-altitude positions, ride out the displacement, and return to a clean surface. Enlil added one final clause before closing the session, an oath. Every god present swore on the authority of Anu to maintain absolute silence. No communication with the Adamu. No intervention, no whispered instructions, no coded messages, nothing. The created ones would die in ignorance, That was the price of Enki's experiment, and Enlil intended to collect it in full. Enki swore the oath. His mouth formed the words. His voice carried them across the chamber. 19 witnesses heard him commit to silence. He walked out of Eridu into the evening heat and crossed the marshlands back to the Abzu alone. The sky was clear. Stars reflected on the water surface in patterns the Adamu had learned to read. Patterns he had taught them. Somewhere south, in settlements along the river, tens of thousands of beings he had shaped from clay and blood were sleeping, eating, teaching their children to press symbols into wet tablets. They had no word for flood. They had no concept of extinction. They trusted the sky the way a child trusts a ceiling. Absolutely, without question, without imagining it could fall. He sat in the Abzu until the water around his feet went cold. The oath burned in his throat like something swallowed that refused to go down. 15-4. Silence. Extinction by committee vote. He pulled a fresh tablet from the shelf and pressed his stylus into the clay, writing nothing, just holding the point against the surface, feeling the resistance, thinking about walls. Walls made of reeds. Walls thin enough for a voice to pass through. Walls that could hear an oath being broken if someone was brave enough or desperate enough to speak to them. Wall of reeds, listen to my words. Enki spoke facing the woven partition inside a storage building at the edge of Shurupak. His back to the room, his hands at his sides. On the other side of the reeds, breathing, quick, shallow, the breath of a man who had been summoned in the middle of the night by a messenger who would not give a name. Ziusudra pressed his ear against the weave. The voice coming through smelled like marsh water and something older, something that made his knees want to bend. The oath said no god could speak to a human. Enki was not speaking to a human. He was speaking to a wall. The distinction was absurd. The distinction was everything. If Enlil intercepted the transmission logs, if the orbital arrays caught voice patterns, Enki was talking to construction material. What a man on the other side chose to overhear was not his responsibility. Language. The weapon he had given the Adamu turned in his hand now, cutting a hole in the oath just wide enough to push survival through. Tear down your house, build a vessel. The dimensions, 60 cubits on each side. Seal it with bitumen inside and out. Load your family, load grain, load every animal you can gather in pairs. Ziusudra's hands were shaking against the reeds. He did not ask why. Something in the voice, in the weight behind each word, made questions feel like a waste of the little time being offered. How long? He whispered. You will know when the birds stop flying. Enki paused. The reed wall moved slightly between them, pushed by a breath or a tremor, or the weight of what was passing through it. Do not wait for the rain. By the time rain falls, the water will already be above your door. Ziusudra built in secret. His neighbors in Shurupak watched him tear down a house that had taken 2 seasons to construct and stack the timber into a shape that made no sense on dry land. A box, sealed, windowless except for a single opening at the top that he covered with stretched hide. His wife carried grain aboard in baskets at night. His sons hauled animals up a ramp that groaned under the weight of livestock never meant to stand on wood. People asked questions. He answered none of them. The voice through the reeds had not told him to explain. It had told him to build. And the urgency in that voice left no space for anything except obedience. 7 days before the water, the birds stopped. All of them, simultaneously. The sky above Shurupak went from a living thing Wings, calls, movement in every direction, to empty canvas, silent. The dogs in the settlement pressed themselves flat against the ground and whined at a frequency that made children cover their ears. Ziusudra heard it from inside the vessel, where he was sealing the last interior joints with heated pitch. His hands stopped. The bitumen cooled on the brush. He looked at his wife. She looked at the ceiling. Above them, through the hide cover, the sky had turned a color that had no name. Not grey, not green, not black. Something between all three. A color that said, "This is the last thing you will see before everything changes." He sealed the door from inside. The pitch hardened fast in the dropping temperature. Through the hull, he could hear sounds from the settlement. Voices first, confused, then urgent, then screaming. Running feet on packed earth. Children calling names. Animals breaking loose from pens. Then a sound beneath all of it, low, constant, growing. The sound of water moving at a volume the human ear was never designed to process. A vibration more than a noise, felt in the teeth and the sternum before it reached the ears. The vessel shifted, lifted. The floor tilted, and Ziusudra grabbed the center beam with both hands. His wife held their youngest son against her body. The animals screamed in their pens. Outside, Sharuppak disappeared. The water did not rise, it arrived. A wall moving across the plain faster than anything on legs could outrun. It took the buildings first, then the trees, then the ground itself, pulling soil and clay and 6,000 years of civilization into a current that had no direction, because direction requires a shore, and there were no shores left. Ziusudra felt the vessel spin. Once, twice. Then the hull caught the surface current and stabilized into a drift that would last 7 days, across a world that no longer had a single visible landmark. Inside, in the dark, in the smell of animal fear and wet pitch and grain already starting to mold, he closed his eyes and heard, beneath the roar of water against wood, the echo of a voice speaking to a wall made of reeds. Day 1. The sky sealed shut like a lid pressed down on a pot. No horizon, no light source, just grey moving against darker grey in every direction, and rain falling so thick it erased the difference between air and water. Inside the vessel, Ziusudra counted his people in the dark by touching their heads. Wife, 3 sons, 2 daughters, 4 grandchildren. 11. The animals made noise constantly. Goats slamming their bodies against pen walls. Birds beating wings inside cages, too small for panic. The vessel rocked in a rhythm that had no pattern, lurching sideways without warning, and the sound of water against the hull was so constant it stopped being a sound and became the texture of existence itself. Day 2 took the smell. Whatever air entered through the vent at the top carried moisture and rot. The grain stores in the lower hold were sitting in 3 fingers of water that had seeped through a joint Ziusudra thought he had sealed. His eldest son dove under with a torch and came up gasping. The bitumen had held everywhere except a seam along the starboard base where the timber had warped from the vessel's own weight. They packed it with animal fat and cloth. It held, barely. The torch went out and nobody relit it. Darkness was easier than seeing the faces around him. Day 3 brought the first death. A goat. Stress cardiac failure. The animal dropped mid-stride in its pen and did not move again. Ziusudra's wife dragged the body to the far corner. They could not throw it overboard. Opening the door meant letting the ocean in. So the goat stayed. And by day 4, the smell of its decomposition mixed with the smell of wet grain and animal waste and human sweat until breathing became an act of will rather than instinct. The children stopped crying. not because they felt better, because their bodies had run out of the energy required to produce tears. Above the water, the gods watched from the orbital station. Screens showed a planet without continents. Brown water stretching in every direction, carrying debris, timber, clay bricks, bodies of animals and humans, and the shattered remains of everything the Adamu had built across 200 rotations of civilization. Ninhursag sat in front of the central display and wept, open, loud, uncontrolled. She grabbed her own face with both hands and pulled at her skin like she was trying to remove it. My creatures, I shaped them. I breathed on them. No one in the station spoke. Enlil stood at the far wall with his arms crossed, watching the same screens, his face carrying nothing. Absolutely nothing. The emptiness of a man who has made a decision and refuses to experience its consequences. Day 5. Ziusudra released a dove through the upper vent. It flew into the grey and vanished. He waited 6 hours. The bird did not return. No land, nowhere to rest. He released a swallow on day 6. Same result. Grey sky swallowing wings. His youngest daughter asked him a question he could not answer. Where did the ground go? He held her against his chest. The vessel drifted. The water beneath them was deep enough to hold every mountain they had ever seen, and still show nothing above the surface. Day 7. The rain thinned, not stopped, thinned, enough for the grey to lighten towards something that might eventually become white. Ziusudra released a raven through the vent. It flew east, circled, came back with mud on its feet. Mud! He stared at the bird's claws for a long time. Mud meant ground. Ground meant the water was dropping. Ground meant the world still existed somewhere underneath all of this. He pressed his forehead against the hull and felt the wood vibrate against his skin. A different vibration now. Slower. The current was losing force. Something solid was pushing back against the water from below. On the morning of the 8th day, the vessel stopped moving. A grinding sound ran through the hull from bow to stern. Wood scraping against rock. The impact knocked Ziusudra sideways into the grain stores. He stood, climbed the interior ladder to the vent, pushed the hide cover aside. Light hit his face. Real light, raw sunlight cutting through broken cloud. And below the vessel, visible through gaps in the receding water, the peak of a mountain. Brown rock, wet, steaming in the sudden heat. He could see maybe 200 meters in every direction before the water took over again. But it was land. Solid. Still. The vessel sat on the summit of Mount Nisir, like something placed there by a hand large enough to hold the world. Ziusudra dropped to his knees on the deck. He did not pray. He did not have the language for what he felt. He just knelt there, face in the sun, breathing air that tasted like stone and salt, and the raw beginning of something that did not have a name yet. Smoke. That was what brought them down. Ziusudra slaughtered a sheep on the mountaintop and burned it on a fire built from broken penwood. The smoke rose thin and straight through still air. The first vertical line on a planet that had been nothing but horizontal water for 7 days. The smell reached the orbital station before the visual confirmation did. Enlil detected the carbon signature on his atmospheric scanner and froze. Someone had survived. Something was burning meat on a surface that should have been empty. He turned to the command crew. "Take me down." Ninhursag landed first, ran across wet rock toward the vessel without protocol, without clearance, without dignity. The Adamu on the deck, thin, filthy, blinking against a sky they had not seen in 8 days, watched her come. She grabbed the nearest one, held it. A being she had shaped from clay and blood and her own saliva, still breathing, still warm on a mountain surrounded by the corpse of a world. She did not let go for a long time. Enlil walked across the summit toward the fire, where Ziusudra knelt beside the burning offering. Roasted meat filling the air, the first food smell on the planet since the water came. He stopped 3 meters from the man. "Who told you to build?" Ziusudra kept his eyes on the flames. "No one told me. I heard a wall speaking." Enlil turned toward Enki, who stood at the edge of the peak, looking out over brown water that still covered everything below 1,000 meters. He did not need a confession. The answer was standing right there with his hands at his sides, watching the flood recede with the patience of someone who had already accepted what this would cost him. 3 hours of argument on open rock. Enlil wanted judgment. Oath broken. Council defied. Anu's voice came through the relay. Old, tired, stretched thin across the distance between 2 dying worlds. "Enough. The waterfalls. The created ones survive. We deal with what is." Enlil absorbed it without flinching. Anu continued. "New terms. The Adamu govern themselves. We withdraw from direct contact. They will remember us however they choose. Gods, kings, shadows in their oldest stories. Our time on this surface is finished. Withdrawal took 40 rotations. Equipment dismantled. The Abzu sealed and buried under river sediment that would hide it for millennia. Eridu stripped to bare foundations. The Igigi, restless, changed by their years on the surface, were ordered to orbital stations for redeployment. Some obeyed. Others had taken Adamu women during the long rotations between the rebellion and the flood. Children had been born from those unions, half divine, half clay, carrying blood from 2 species in bodies that aged faster than one parent and slower than the other. These Igigi refused the recall order. They vanished into the valleys and the mountain passes, choosing the mud planet over the dying star. Their names disappeared from the manifests. Their bloodlines sank into the human population like rivers sinking into sand. Invisible on the surface, still flowing underneath, Enki spent his last rotation at the edge of the marshlands where the Abzu had been. Water had receded enough to expose the plain. Brown mud to the horizon, empty, scraped clean of every city and canal the Adamu had built. And already, in the distance, 30 of them working, digging channels, stacking bricks, a child on a woman's hip watching the adults shape wet clay into blocks, her hands opening and closing around the air, mimicking the motion, learning without being taught. Enki watched until the transport signal pulsed in his ear for the 3rd time. He did not wave. He did not leave a message. He walked to the landing site without looking back, because looking back meant answering a question he had carried since the first Adamu opened its eyes. Did I make them for us, or for themselves? The transport broke atmosphere at dusk. The planet turned below the viewport, blue returning to the oceans, green pushing at the edges of river deltas, clouds forming in patterns that looked almost intentional. Below, on the mud flat, the child had picked up a piece of wet clay. She pressed her thumb into it. 5 ridges, a perfect print. She did not know that a god had made the same mark in the same clay in a sealed chamber thousands of years before her first breath. She just liked the way it felt. Cool, soft, ready to become something. And that ordinary act, repeated without memory or instruction on a planet the gods had given up on, was the only answer that ever mattered.